In the autumn of 1994, in a quiet town along the western edge of Ohio, there lived a woman named Margaret Hale. At 26, she was known for her gentle manners, her careful speech, and the dependable rhythm of her life. She worked as a circulation clerk at the county library, where the scent of old paper and polished wood gave her a sense of order she rarely questioned. Her days were predictable, shelving returns, helping children find chapter books, smiling politely at retirees who lingered longer than necessary just to talk. Margaret lived with her Aunt Clara in a modest white house with blue shutters. Clara had raised her after her parents passed away within a year of each other. The household was guided by faith, routine, and the unspoken belief that a woman's security lay in marriage. Margaret absorbed those lessons without rebellion. She believed in commitment, in patience, in doing what was expected. That was how she met Stephen Whitmore. Stephen was 34, composed, and deeply embedded in the local church community. He led Bible study on Wednesday evenings and handled financial records for a manufacturing supplier in the neighboring town. He dressed conservatively, spoke softly, and carried himself with the steady confidence of a man who never appeared shaken. When he began walking Margaret to her car after Sunday service, the attention felt like validation. When he asked permission to visit her at home, Clara nearly cried with gratitude. A man like Stephen, she insisted, was rare, disciplined, stable, morally grounded. Their courtship lasted 5 months. It was respectful to the point of restraint. Stephen never allowed his hand to linger at her waist. He kissed her cheek, occasionally her lips, but never with urgency. Margaret interpreted that as integrity. She told herself that desire expressed too openly was a flaw, and Stephen, in her eyes, had none. When he proposed, it was after an evening service, beneath the soft glow of the church parking lot lights. He spoke of partnership, of building a God-centered home, of raising children who would honor their values. Margaret said yes before doubt could form. The wedding took place in early spring. Pale roses lined the altar. Friends filled the pews. Margaret walked down the aisle believing she was stepping into the life she had been shaped to desire. Stability, family, devotion. That night, inside the small townhouse Stephen had purchased months earlier, the air felt heavier than she expected. Margaret changed in the bathroom, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but anticipation. She had been taught that intimacy belonged inside marriage, that it was both sacred and inevitable. When she emerged, Stephen was sitting at the edge of the bed, loosening his tie. He smiled faintly and said he was exhausted from a long day. "Tomorrow," he assured her gently. "Let's not rush something important." He kissed her forehead, turned off the lamp, and lay down facing the wall. Margaret stared at the ceiling in the darkness, telling herself this was normal. Weddings were tiring. Nerves were understandable. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow was not different. The following evening, Stephen buried himself in paperwork at the kitchen table. The next night, he complained of a headache. By the end of the week, Margaret had stopped initiating even small gestures. When she reached for his hand in bed, he shifted subtly away, murmuring apologies that sounded practiced. 2 weeks later, she asked if something was wrong. Stephen sighed, eyes lowering. He explained that he was dealing with a personal medical matter. Nothing serious, he insisted. Just something that required patience and reduced pressure. He promised it would resolve in time. Margaret nodded, ashamed for asking. Outside the bedroom, their life looked enviably peaceful. They attended church together, hosted small dinners, shopped for groceries side by side. Neighbors commented on how well-suited they seemed. Stephen opened doors for her. He spoke kindly. He never raised his voice. But at night, the space between them felt wider than the mattress allowed. Margaret began scrutinizing herself in mirrors. She bought new nightgowns in muted colors she believed he might prefer. She styled her hair differently. She applied perfume before bed, then washed it off when he turned away without noticing. Months passed. Her aunt began asking gentle questions about grandchildren. Women from church shared knowing smiles and advice about early pregnancy fatigue. Margaret learned to deflect with grace. "We're taking our time," she would say. The lie tasted metallic in her mouth. By their 4th month of marriage, Margaret had mastered silent crying. She pressed her face into her pillow, stifling the sound so Stephen would not hear. He slept soundly, back turned, breathing even and undisturbed. One evening, during a lunch break at work, a colleague named Denise, recently divorced and unafraid of uncomfortable truths, watched Margaret more closely than others did. "You don't look like a newlywed," Denise said bluntly. Margaret laughed lightly. "What does that even look like?" "Alive," Denise replied. "You look lonely." The word lodged itself deep. Margaret dismissed it publicly, but carried it home privately. At her aunt's urging, she visited a physician under the pretense of ensuring everything was healthy for starting a family. The examination was clinical and brief. The doctor, an experienced woman in her 50s, asked careful questions. "How long have you been married?" "Nearly 6 months." The doctor paused. "Margaret," she said gently, "your body indicates that you have not been sexually active." Margaret felt heat rise to her face. She insisted there must be a mistake. There was no mistake. She left the clinic in a haze, gripping her steering wheel long after the engine started. That evening, she watched Stephen differently. Not with hope, but with awareness. She noticed how he avoided looking at her when she undressed. How he changed clothes in the dark. How physical contact, even accidental, caused him to stiffen almost imperceptibly. A pattern began forming in her mind, one she resisted at first. Stephen's Saturday routines had grown more rigid. He left at noon, dressed more carefully than usual, claiming work meetings that never included her. He returned calmer than he ever appeared at home. One Saturday, Margaret followed him. She felt foolish and ashamed as she trailed his car from a distance. He drove not toward his office, but toward a quieter neighborhood near the riverfront. He parked outside a brick apartment complex. Margaret remained across the street, heart pounding. Stephen entered the building. 40 minutes later, he emerged alongside a man Margaret had never seen before. The man's hand rested briefly at the small of Stephen's back as they spoke. Their proximity was intimate, not exaggerated, but unmistakable. Stephen's face held a softness Margaret had never witnessed. She returned home before he did, sitting rigidly at the kitchen table until he walked through the door. "How was your afternoon?" she asked. "Productive," he replied smoothly. That night, Margaret did not cry. She lay awake, clarity spreading slowly through her like dawn light. She could not stop. A week later, Stephen forgot his phone on the dresser. Margaret had never invaded his privacy before, but silence had already stolen enough from her. The messages were explicit in emotion, affectionate in tone, and unmistakable in meaning. They spoke of longing, shared afternoons, frustration with secrecy. Stephen was not broken. He was divided. When he returned home, Margaret did not shout. She did not tremble. She asked him to sit. She told him what she had read. Stephen's shoulders sagged as if relief and fear had collided at once. He admitted he had always struggled with his identity, that he believed marriage would correct him, that he had hoped desire could be forced into alignment with expectation. He said he never meant to hurt her. Margaret listened quietly. For the first time in months, she felt no confusion, only certainty. She asked him to leave. There were no dramatic ultimatums.
No spectacle.
Just the quiet unraveling of a life constructed on denial. When the door closed behind him, Margaret sat alone in the stillness of a house that had never truly been hers. The marriage had lasted less than a year. It had never truly begun. She cried, not because she was unwanted, but because she finally understood she never had a chance to be wanted at all. And somewhere beneath the grief, something unexpected stirred. Relief. The first week after Stephen left did not feel real to Margaret. It felt staged, like a scene from someone else's life in which she had been miscast. The townhouse seemed larger without him, but not emptier. Strangely, the silence felt different now. It was no longer heavy with confusion. It was sharp, echoing, honest. She did not go to work that Monday. She called the library and told them she had the flu. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. She spent the day sitting on the living room floor, back against the couch, staring at the blank television screen. Every room held a memory, but now each one appeared altered, like a photograph that had been retouched until the truth blurred. The kitchen table where they had eaten dinner side by side in polite conversation. The hallway where he had kissed her cheek before leaving for work. The bedroom where two bodies had lain inches apart, yet lived in separate worlds. Margaret expected anger to arrive first. It did not. What came instead was humiliation. Not because Stephen loved someone else. Not even because he had lied. The humiliation came from realizing how long she had doubted herself. How deeply she had believed she was the problem. She had prayed harder, tried softer, made herself smaller. She had rearranged her own sense of worth to accommodate his silence. And none of it had ever been about her. On the third day, her Aunt Clara arrived unannounced. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, taking in Margaret's pale face and swollen eyes. She did not ask questions immediately. She made tea. She sat down beside her niece and placed a hand over hers. "Where is Stephen?" she asked gently. Margaret could have lied again. It would have been easier. But something in her had shifted. The truth, once spoken, did not frighten her as much anymore.
"He's gone," she said.
The words trembled, but they did not break. Margaret told her everything. The untouched marriage, the doctor's visit, the man by the riverfront apartments, the messages on the phone, the confession. Clara listened without interruption, her grip tightening only once. When Margaret finished, the house felt quieter than before. Clara did not react with outrage. She did not speak ill of Stephen. Instead, she asked one question. "Did you know?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I felt something was wrong, but I thought it was me." Clara exhaled deeply. "It was never you." Those 4 words landed heavier than any accusation could have. News in a small town does not travel, it multiplies. Within 2 weeks, whispers followed Margaret into the grocery store. Familiar faces studied her more openly than before. Some expressed sympathy with careful distance. Others avoided eye contact entirely, as if divorce carried contagion. At church, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Conversations quieted when she approached. One woman asked if she had tried harder. Another suggested counseling could have preserved the marriage. Margaret stopped attending after that Sunday. She was not ashamed of the truth. She was simply exhausted from defending it. Stephen attempted contact twice. The first time, he left a voicemail apologizing again. The second time, he appeared at the townhouse late in the afternoon. Margaret opened the door, but did not invite him in. He looked smaller somehow, less composed. "I never meant to hurt you," he repeated. Margaret studied him with a clarity she wished she had possessed months earlier. He looked afraid. Not of her anger, but of exposure. Of living honestly. "You didn't mean to hurt me," she said quietly. "But you did." There was nothing more to add. The legal process unfolded with uncomfortable efficiency. Because the marriage had not been consummated, the attorney suggested an annulment rather than a divorce. The words sounded clinical, almost dismissive, like the marriage had been erased rather than ended. Margaret signed the papers with steady hands. Annulled.
As if it had never existed.
But it had existed. In her body. In her prayers. In her loneliness. The months that followed were defined by rebuilding, not in dramatic gestures, but in small, deliberate acts. Margaret returned to work. The library, once a refuge, now felt like neutral ground. Denise noticed the change immediately. "You told him to leave, didn't you?" Denise asked one afternoon. Margaret nodded. Denise smiled, not cruelly but approvingly. "Good." For the first time, Margaret did not feel judged. She began therapy that autumn, quietly driving 40 minutes to a neighboring town to avoid curious glances. The therapist, Dr. Reynolds, asked questions Margaret had never considered. "What did you learn about yourself in that marriage?" Margaret hesitated at first. Then words began to form. "I learned how quickly I disappear when I'm afraid." That realization became the turning point. She started noticing patterns, not just in Stephen's behavior, but in her own. The way she avoided conflict. The way she equated patience with virtue, even when patience was harming her. The way she mistook silence for strength. Therapy did not erase pain, but it reframed it. Stephen's fear had shaped his choices. His repression had dictated his actions. But Margaret's silence had allowed the lie to continue. Understanding that distinction did not create guilt. It created awareness. By winter, Margaret decided to move out of the townhouse entirely. Staying there felt like living inside a memory she no longer needed. She found a small apartment above a bakery downtown. The scent of bread in the mornings felt comforting, grounding. For the first time in years, she chose something without asking permission. She bought new furniture, nothing extravagant, just pieces that felt like hers. A blue armchair by the window. A wooden desk where she began journaling at night. She painted the bedroom walls a soft sage green. Color returned gradually to her world. She began taking evening walks through town, headphones on, listening to music she had never explored before. She signed up for a continuing education class at the community college, Introduction to Art History, simply because it interested her. Freedom did not arrive as fireworks. It arrived quietly, like breath returning after being held too long. There were still difficult nights. Certain hymns made her chest tighten. The sight of wedding announcements in the newspaper triggered unexpected waves of grief. But the grief felt clean now, no longer tangled in confusion. One evening in early spring, Margaret ran into Stephen by accident at a bookstore. He looked different, less tense, almost lighter. He was not alone. The man beside him was the same one from the riverfront apartments. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Stephen seemed uncertain whether to approach. Margaret surprised herself. She walked over calmly. "Hello, Stephen." He introduced the man as Andrew. There was no pretense in his voice this time. No coded language.
No evasive tone.
Margaret nodded politely. "I hope you're well," she said. And she meant it. Walking away, she expected a surge of bitterness. Instead, she felt something unexpected. Closure. Stephen's truth was no longer hidden. It no longer cast a shadow over her. The marriage had not failed because she lacked beauty or warmth or faith. It had failed because it was built on fear. That realization gave her something invaluable.
Peace.
As summer approached, Margaret stood at her apartment window one evening watching people move along the sidewalk below. Couples laughed outside restaurants. Children tugged at their parents' hands. Life continued, indifferent to her private upheaval. For the first time, she did not feel left behind. She felt open. The marriage that never began had ended. The silence that once suffocated her had been broken. And in its place stood something stronger than patience. self-respect. Margaret did not yet know what her future would hold. She did not know whether she would marry again. She did not know how long healing would take. But she knew this. She would never again trade truth for appearance. She would never again shrink to fit inside someone else's fear. And she would never again mistake loneliness for devotion. The second chapter of her life had begun, not with romance, but with clarity. And that clarity was enough. The second year after the annulment was quieter than the first, but in many ways it was more important. The sharpness of shock had faded, leaving space for something subtler, self-examination. Margaret no longer woke up with the immediate weight of betrayal pressing on her chest. Instead, she woke up with questions. Not about Stephen, about herself. She had spent months untangling the obvious truths, that she had not been undesirable, that she had not failed as a wife, that someone else's repression had shaped the marriage. But beneath those conclusions lay deeper layers. Why had she stayed silent so long? Why had she accepted explanations that never fully satisfied her instincts? Why had she been so afraid to confront what she already sensed? Dr. Reynolds guided her gently through those questions. "You were raised to equate obedience with goodness," the therapist said one afternoon. "When something felt wrong, you assumed you were the one misinterpreting it." Margaret recognized the pattern instantly. As a child, challenging authority had been discouraged. Questioning a man's leadership was considered disrespectful. Doubt was framed as weakness of faith. She had carried those teachings into adulthood without realizing how deeply they shaped her reactions. For most of her life, Margaret had believed that strength meant endurance, that love meant tolerance, that sacrifice was proof of character. Now she was beginning to see that silence can be a disguise for fear. The community college course she had enrolled in, art history, unexpectedly became more than a casual distraction. On Tuesday evenings, she sat in a bright classroom filled with students of varying ages, studying paintings that told stories of longing, rebellion, devotion, and transformation. One lecture focused on portraits, how artists capture not just faces but inner lives. The professor spoke about gaze and presence, about how being truly seen by another human being changes the meaning of existence. Margaret found herself writing that phrase in her notebook.
To be seen is to exist.
For months, she had existed in a marriage where she was barely perceived. The realization did not fill her with bitterness anymore. It filled her with resolve. That winter, she began volunteering at a literacy program on weekends. Working with adults learning to read required patience of a different kind, one that empowered rather than erased. She discovered she had a gift for encouragement. She was steady without being overbearing, kind without diminishing herself. In helping others find their voices, she strengthened her own. Socially, her circle shifted as well. Some acquaintances from church drifted away after the annulment, unsure how to categorize her. But new friendships emerged, colleagues from the college, neighbors in her apartment building, Denise from the library, who remained a constant presence. Denise, blunt as ever, insisted Margaret join her for dinner one Friday night. "You've rebuilt your life," Denise said over pasta and wine. "Now you need to live it." Margaret laughed softly. "I am living it." "You're healing," Denise corrected. "That's not the same thing." The distinction lingered long after the meal ended. Margaret had avoided dating entirely, not because she feared men, but because she feared repeating patterns. The idea of trusting someone with her vulnerability again felt daunting. Yet loneliness, she realized, was different from solitude. Solitude had become nourishing. She enjoyed reading in her blue armchair. She enjoyed cooking for herself. She enjoyed the independence of making plans without negotiation. But sometimes, late at night, she missed conversation that stretched beyond surface details. She missed shared laughter. She missed the possibility of intimacy, real intimacy, not the hollow imitation she once endured. Spring arrived with subtle warmth. One Saturday afternoon, while browsing the local farmer's market, Margaret reached for a basket of strawberries at the same moment as someone else. "Sorry," a warm voice said. She looked up to find a man about her age, perhaps slightly older, with kind eyes and an unassuming smile. "Please," she said, gesturing for him to take them. They both laughed at the awkward politeness. His name was Daniel Mercer. He taught history at the community college, the same campus where Margaret worked as an administrative assistant. Somehow their paths had never crossed meaningfully before. Their conversation that day lasted only 10 minutes, but it felt easy, unforced. Daniel did not dominate the discussion or retreat into silence. He asked questions and listened attentively to her answers. When he suggested coffee sometime, Margaret surprised herself by saying yes, without overthinking it. The first meeting was cautious on her part. She told herself it was only coffee.
No expectations. No assumptions.
They spoke about books, travel, family. Daniel shared stories about his sister and her children. He mentioned his own divorce years earlier, describing it plainly, without resentment. Margaret decided early that if this connection continued, she would not hide her past. On their third outing, a walk through a nearby park, she told him, not every detail, but enough. The unconsummated marriage, the discovery, the annulment. She watched his expression carefully, prepared for discomfort or curiosity. Instead, Daniel said quietly, "That must have been incredibly isolating."
No judgment.
No intrusive questions, just recognition. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Over the following months, they met regularly. There was no rush. Daniel did not push for physical closeness. When he reached for her hand for the first time, it was tentative, giving her space to withdraw if she wished. She did not withdraw. The difference between this connection and her first marriage was not dramatic passion. It was transparency. Daniel spoke openly about his thoughts. When something bothered him, he addressed it. When he felt uncertain, he admitted it. Margaret practiced doing the same. Once, when she felt herself pulling back emotionally after a particularly vulnerable conversation, she recognized the instinct immediately. Instead of retreating, she told him, "I'm not used to being this honest," she admitted. He nodded. "We'll take it at your pace." There was no pressure in his tone. The first time they shared a kiss that carried genuine desire, Margaret did not feel anxiety. She felt presence. She felt chosen. It startled her how different intimacy felt when rooted in mutual openness. There was no performance.
No pretending.
No waiting for tomorrow that never arrived. There was simply two people meeting each other fully. Still, healing is rarely linear. There were evenings when memories surfaced unexpectedly, moments in the townhouse, when she had questioned her worth. On those nights, Margaret struggled with vulnerability, afraid that old fears might resurface. But Daniel's steadiness did not waver. "You're allowed to take your time," he reminded her once. "Trust isn't rushed." Margaret realized something profound during those months. Love without honesty is fragile, but honesty without fear is powerful. By the end of the year, Margaret felt something she had not experienced in decades. Confidence, not the loud kind, but the quiet certainty of someone who knows her value. She no longer scanned mirrors for flaws. She no longer interpreted silence as rejection. She no longer confused patience with self-erasure. When Daniel asked her one evening if she believed in remarriage, she did not answer immediately. She thought of her past, not as a wound, but as a lesson. "I believe in partnership," she said carefully, "if it's built on truth." He smiled. "That's all I want." Margaret understood then that the third chapter of her life was not about replacing what had been lost. It was about redefining what love meant.
To be seen.
to be heard, to be touched without hesitation, to speak without shrinking. She did not know yet where this relationship would lead. She did not need guarantees. What mattered was that she was no longer hiding from others or from herself. For years, she had believed liberation would feel dramatic. Instead, it felt steady. It felt like walking forward without looking over her shoulder. And for the first time, Margaret was not afraid of what came next. Margaret did not rush into marriage again. That decision alone marked how much she had changed. In her 20s, engagement had felt like confirmation, proof she had fulfilled an expectation. Now, in her early 30s, commitment meant something different. It was no longer about securing stability or meeting anyone's timeline. It was about alignment, honesty, emotional safety. Her relationship with Daniel unfolded gradually, without spectacle. They dated for nearly 2 years before discussing the possibility of sharing a home. In that time, Margaret observed him carefully, not with suspicion, but with awareness. She watched how he handled frustration when plans changed. She noticed whether he avoided difficult conversations or leaned into them. She paid attention to small things, how he treated waitstaff at restaurants, how he spoke about his ex-wife without bitterness, how he reacted when she expressed disagreement. There were disagreements. The first significant one occurred over something seemingly trivial: holiday plans. Daniel assumed they would split time evenly between families. Margaret hesitated. The holidays still carried complicated memories for her. The townhouse, the 4 smiles, the hollow silence beneath festive music. Instead of swallowing her discomfort, she spoke it aloud. "I need to move slower with traditions," she told him. "They're not simple for me." Daniel listened. He did not dismiss her hesitation or accuse her of overreacting. They talked through it, calmly, respectfully, until they found a compromise. It was a small conflict, but it meant everything. Margaret realized that healthy love was not the absence of disagreement. It was the presence of resolution. When Daniel proposed, he did so quietly during a weekend trip to a lakeside cabin in Michigan. There were no public declarations, no dramatic gestures. Just the two of them sitting on a wooden dock at sunset. "I don't want perfection," he said. "I want partnership. With you." Margaret did not feel the anxious rush she had experienced years before. She felt grounded.
She said yes.
Their wedding reflected that groundedness. A modest ceremony in a botanical garden. Close friends. A few family members. No performance, no pressure to impress. Margaret wore a simple ivory dress. Not because tradition demanded it, but because she liked it. When she walked toward Daniel, she did not carry uncertainty. She carried clarity. Their first night as husband and wife was nothing like the night that once haunted her memory. There was no awkward avoidance, no rehearsed excuses. There was tenderness and patience and open communication. When she felt nervous, she said so. When he sensed hesitation, he slowed down. Intimacy was not an obligation. It was mutual. Margaret cried afterward, not from sadness, but from relief. Years of silent doubt dissolved in that moment. Not because physical closeness defined her worth, but because it symbolized something deeper. She was no longer invisible. Marriage with Daniel was not perfect. It was real. They argued occasionally about finances, about work schedules, about whose turn it was to handle certain responsibilities. But conflict never lingered unresolved. They had both learned, through previous mistakes, that silence breeds distance. 2 years into their marriage, Margaret gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Caroline. Holding her newborn in her arms, Margaret felt an overwhelming mixture of joy and responsibility. She wanted to raise her daughter differently. She wanted Caroline to know that love does not require shrinking, that obedience is not the same as goodness, that intuition deserves attention. Motherhood reshaped Margaret's perspective again. The long nights, the exhaustion, the fierce protectiveness, all of it deepened her sense of self. She was no longer the young woman waiting quietly in a dark bedroom. She was a mother, a partner, a person with a voice. 2 years later, a son followed, Ethan, quiet and observant like his father. Their home filled with noise and chaos and laughter. Toys scattered across living room floors. School projects taped to refrigerator doors. Arguments about bedtime. Weekend family walks through the park. Ordinary life. And that ordinariness felt extraordinary to Margaret because it was built on truth. There were still moments when the past surfaced unexpectedly. A sermon about traditional marriage. A new story about hidden lives. Occasionally, memories of Stephen would appear, not with bitterness, but with a distant sadness. One evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret told Daniel she sometimes wondered what had become of her first husband. Daniel did not tense. He did not feel threatened. "Do you miss him?" he asked gently. "No," she said honestly. "I just wonder if he ever found peace." Daniel reached for her hand. That's compassion, not longing. She realized he was right. Compassion no longer cost her anything. In her 40s, Margaret transitioned from administrative work to teaching part-time at the community college. Encouraged by Daniel, she completed additional certifications and began instructing introductory literature courses. Standing in front of a classroom, discussing themes of identity and truth in novels, she sometimes caught herself smiling at the irony. She had lived those themes. Her students appreciated her calm presence. She never lectured harshly. She invited discussion. She encouraged differing viewpoints. Stories matter, she often told them, because they reveal what silence hides. At home, Daniel supported her ambitions without hesitation. When grading papers overwhelmed her, he cooked dinner. When his own workload intensified, she stepped in. Their partnership functioned like a steady rhythm, sometimes one led, sometimes the other, but always in sync. Time moved forward, as it inevitably does. Caroline left for college. Ethan followed 2 years later. The house grew quieter, though not empty. Margaret and Daniel rediscovered long conversations over dinner. Weekend trips. Shared reading in the evenings. It was during one of those quiet years that Daniel began experiencing unexplained fatigue. At first, they dismissed it as stress. Then came the medical tests, the appointments, the diagnosis. Chronic illness does not announce itself politely. It rearranges everything. Margaret recognized the shift immediately, not with panic, but with determination. This time, silence would not define her experience. She asked questions at appointments. She researched treatment options. She accompanied Daniel to every consultation. And most importantly, they talked openly about fear. There were nights when Daniel admitted he was scared. Nights when Margaret allowed herself to cry in front of him instead of pretending to be endlessly strong. Their intimacy changed during those years, not in disappearance, but in form. Physical closeness sometimes gave way to quiet companionship. Holding hands in hospital waiting rooms. Sitting side by side on the couch, saying nothing, yet feeling understood. Margaret realized that true partnership adapts. It does not vanish under pressure. When Daniel's condition worsened, their world narrowed to what mattered most: honesty, presence, gratitude. The day he passed away was peaceful. Margaret was holding his hand. Their children stood nearby. There were no unresolved words between them. Grief arrived fiercely, but it was clean. She mourned not confusion, not betrayal, not wasted years, but a love that had been fully lived. After the funeral, the house felt impossibly quiet. Yet even in that silence, Margaret did not feel erased. She had been seen. She had been chosen. She had loved and been loved without disguise. That knowledge became her anchor. In the months that followed, she leaned on her children, her friends, her students. She continued teaching, continued volunteering, continued living. At 55, she understood something her younger self never could. Pain does not define a life. Truth does. And though she now lived alone, she did not feel the kind of loneliness that once haunted her. The difference was profound. Loneliness born from invisibility is suffocating. Solitude born from completeness is peaceful. Margaret carried Daniel's memory not as a wound, but as proof that love rooted in honesty is possible. Her story had not ended in betrayal. It had unfolded into something far richer. And though grief still visited her in quiet moments, it no longer frightened her. She had survived silence. She had chosen truth. And she would never return to a life built on anything less. At 62, Margaret Hale no longer rushed through her mornings. She woke early, as she always had, but now there was no urgency attached to the habit. Sunlight filtered through linen curtains in her small Indiana home, settling softly over hardwood floors worn smooth by decades of ordinary living. She would sit at the edge of her bed for a moment before standing, allowing herself to arrive fully in the day. There had been a time when mornings carried dread, when waking meant stepping back into confusion, back into silence, back into the quiet ache of feeling unseen. That time no longer owned her. Her home now reflected the woman she had become. Framed photographs of Caroline and Ethan lined the hallway. A bookshelf in the living room held novels she had taught for years. A knitted blanket, one Daniel used during his illness, rested neatly over the arm of her blue chair. The house was quiet, yes, but it was not empty. Widowhood had introduced a different kind of solitude than her first marriage ever had. When Daniel passed, grief had filled the rooms like a heavy fog. Yet beneath the sorrow, there was something steady. There had been love. There had been truth. There had been no deception between them. That knowledge made all the difference. Margaret often reflected on the strange symmetry of her life. Her first marriage had ended because of hidden identity. Her second marriage had endured because identity was never hidden at all. The contrast shaped everything she now understood about intimacy. On Wednesdays, she volunteered at a community support group for women navigating divorce, separation, or betrayal. She did not lead with authority. She led with experience. The first time she told her full story publicly, her hands trembled slightly. Not because the pain remained sharp, but because vulnerability always carries risk. The women in the circle listened quietly as she described the untouched marriage, the doctor's revelation, the discovery of messages, the annulment. When she finished, no one spoke for several seconds. Then a younger woman across from her whispered, "I thought I was the only one." Margaret recognized the look in her eyes, the same mixture of shame and confusion she once carried. "You're not," Margaret said gently, "and it isn't your fault." That sentence had once saved her. Now she offered it freely. The world had changed in many ways since the 1990s. Conversations about identity, sexuality, and repression were more open. Margaret understood now the cultural forces that had shaped Stephen's choices. The fear, the expectations, the pressure to conform. She did not hate him, but she no longer excused the damage either. Compassion, she had learned, does not require self-erasure. Sometimes, when she sat alone on her back porch in the evenings, she allowed herself to revisit that first chapter of her adult life, not with resentment, but with clarity. She saw the young woman she had been, obedient, hopeful, terrified of disappointing others. She wished she could place a hand on that younger version's shoulder and whisper what she knows now. Trust the discomfort. Ask the question. Silence is not holy when it harms you. Margaret's children knew her full history. She had chosen honesty when they became adults. One evening years ago, Caroline had asked why her mother was so insistent on open communication in relationships. Margaret had taken a deep breath and told her. Caroline listened quietly, then hugged her tightly. "You deserved better," her daughter had said. Margaret smiled at the memory. "I eventually found better," she had replied. Her grandchildren now visited often, filling the once quiet house with noise and sticky fingerprints. They did not know the complexity of her story yet. To them, she was simply Grandma, the one who baked cinnamon bread and read stories with dramatic voices. But one day, when they were older, she intended to share parts of it. Not the details meant for adults, but the lesson. Love without truth is fragile. Years earlier, after Daniel's death, a neighbor had asked Margaret if she feared being alone again. She had considered the question carefully before answering. "I've already been alone inside a marriage," she said. "That's a different kind of loneliness." That distinction remained the most important truth of her life. There are people who sit beside someone every night and still feel invisible. And there are people who sit alone with complete peace. Margaret belonged to the second group now. Her faith had evolved over time as well. She still believed in God, but not in the version that demanded silent suffering. She no longer equated endurance with virtue. She believed instead in accountability, honesty, and compassion that does not require self-destruction. On quiet afternoons, she sometimes wrote letters she never intended to send. One was addressed to Stephen. In it, she did not accuse him. She did not condemn him. She simply told the truth. "You were afraid. I was silent. We both paid for that silence. I forgive you, but I will never again ignore my own voice." She folded the letter and placed it in a wooden box where she kept personal mementos. It was not meant for him. It was meant for closure. At 62, Margaret no longer needed validation from a partner to feel complete. She had experienced deep romantic love with Daniel. She had experienced motherhood. She had experienced grief and survival and reinvention. What remained now was wisdom. Sometimes younger women asked her if she ever regretted those 3 early years. She always answered the same way. "No," she would say, "because they taught me what I will never accept again." Regret implies wasted time. Margaret no longer saw it that way. She saw education. Painful, yes, but formative. One autumn evening, sitting on her porch as leaves turned gold along the street, she reflected on the word freedom. In her 20s, she had believed freedom meant marriage. In her 30s, she believed it meant independence. In her 40s, she believed it meant partnership rooted in honesty. Now, she understood that freedom meant alignment between what she felt and what she allowed. There was no performance left in her life.
No mask. No polite pretense.
If something felt wrong, she addressed it. If something felt right, she embraced it without apology. Her story, when told aloud, sometimes surprised people. They expected bitterness or anger. They expected dramatic closure. Instead, they encountered calm. The truth had broken her first marriage. The truth had built her second. The truth had reshaped her identity. And now, the truth gave her peace. Margaret rose from her porch chair as the evening air cooled, stepping back inside the house she had made her own. The walls did not echo with loneliness. They held memory, resilience, and the quiet hum of a life honestly lived. She turned off the lights one by one, pausing at the hallway mirror. For a brief moment, she studied her reflection, not searching for flaws as she once had, but acknowledging the woman looking back. She was not the naive bride waiting in darkness. She was not the abandoned wife gripping a steering wheel outside a doctor's office. She was not the widow standing beside a hospital bed. She was all of them, and she was whole. The lesson of her life was simple, though it had taken decades to learn. You cannot build love on fear. You cannot protect others by betraying yourself. And you cannot find peace until you choose truth over appearance. Margaret turned off the final lamp and walked toward her bedroom without hesitation. She did not dread the quiet anymore. She carried light within her now, and that was enough.